So I have to pull up the PDF real quick. Let me find it. Perfect. And let me put it in the Jumbotron. I'm just getting everything ready before I start reading. So you're going to hear quiet for a bit because I'm just adding resources to the Jumbotron. Oh, my bad. I was talking this whole time and I was muted. I wanted to say that in the Jumbotron, I put up what's currently happening in Ghana. And George, who usually holds spaces on here, has been arrested. He's currently detained. He was brutalized along with other people who went out to protest. And what's so funny? I don't know, you laughed at police brutality, but so George was beat up along with other protesters. There was video of a reporter. She was beat up by police and phone stolen, and they're currently being detained without food and water. Luckily, the space they held this morning, they were able to get supplies through people coordinating through the space, and so they currently have food and water. One of the lawyers that's on the ground did say that the people should be getting out hopefully today. Yeah, Odai, you were laughing when I said
No,
that
no,
police brutality was
there's
happening.
a delay in,
Oh,
yeah, so the laughter was when you said we are talking without unmuting. So
oh,
that came such a messed up thing with Twitter. So it now looks horrible. Yeah, I'm following the Ghana thing too. Great of you posting
got
it.
you. I was so surprised. I was like, wait a minute, I've been in spaces with you. Okay, thank you for correcting that. But yeah, I wanted to bring attention to it as well. And I'll definitely be going to their spaces. For the recording, Talk Your Shit is an account on Twitter, and I encourage people to follow it. And they are organizing for another demonstration tomorrow, but then also for further demonstrations going on through December. So please track that, and I'll definitely be posting their spaces as well. I'm going to start reading the book. I'm going to let you know, and this recording is probably going to be very lackluster because I have zero energy, but I really want this material to be on record for others to be able to listen to. So this is called Black Awakening in Capitalist America. I'm just going to pick up reading. In the fall of 1966, there occurred two other events that were of serious importance for the Black liberation movement. In September, the first attempt in the North was made, not altogether intentionally, to apply Black power thinking to a concrete situation. New York City school system was in another crisis. Harlem parents were demanding an effective voice in the running of a school, IS 201. The second event occurred at the other end of the country with little fanfare. The Black Panther Party was founded in October in Oakland, California. For years, Black parents and community leaders have been fighting for an integrated school system in New York. To dramatize their complaint, they organized an impressive school boycott in the spring of 1964. But the impact of the boycott was minimal. The Board of Education paid lip service to the parents' demands, but then went on its way in its usual lumbering fashion. The fall crisis was precipitated by the construction of a model school in central Harlem. When the site was originally selected in 1958, parents had warned the board that the location guaranteed that the school would be segregated. The board blandly replied that the proposed school would be so good that white parents would send their children to it. When the new intermediate school was completed, it faced a pupil boycott. Some 80% of the expected students were Black, and the overwhelming majority of the remainder were Puerto Rican. Clearly, the school was segregated, despite the school board's earlier assurance to the contrary. A negotiating team representing the Harlem community decided that if the school were not to be integrated, then there should be some formal mechanisms for the Black community to participate in setting up a curriculum and selecting personnel for the school. The hope was that such a mechanism would prevent IS 201 from becoming just like every other second-rate ghetto school. At first, the liberal teachers backed the Black parents, but when it appeared that some of their own professional prerogatives would be challenged, they switched sides. The negotiating team demanded two things. It sought the establishment of a special council controlled by parents and the community to run the school in joint control with the school board. And it wanted IS 201 to have a Black principal. At that time, only 4 of New York's 870 principals were Black. The parents wanted a Black principal at the school to provide a positive image for their children. But a white principal, Stanley Lesser, had already been chosen by the school board superintendent, Bernard Donovan. From an individual point of view, Lesser probably was as technically qualified as any, but his appointment conflicted with the changing social consciousness in the Black community. With an extremely tense situation on his hands, Donovan reversed himself and pressured Lesser into resigning. That part I don't understand, where he says that he was qualified. How would you know if he was as equally qualified with the person they wanted to pick when they didn't even present anyone? They just said they wanted a Black principal. So I don't know. I just don't like how this writer is so accommodating to whiteness. But let's continue reading. This provoked an immediate and angry response from the teachers. For them, it was a clear-cut case of race being given priority over qualifications. Again, see, that's where that's what that crack leaves. Because now you're saying, oh yeah, I'm sure he was qualified. How would you know? Like that cracker isn't automatically qualified because probably the Black principal they wanted might have been even more qualified than him. We don't know that because the barricades were put in place so that it doesn't even happen. So, but anyways, from them, it was a clear-cut case of race being, this is from the teachers, the white teachers. For them, it was a clear-cut case of race being given priority over qualifications. And in the professional bureaucratic world, giving preferential consideration to anything but merit is a grave hearsay, a whole nother lie, because there is a great book called When Affirmative Action Was White. And a lot of these teachers, and the ones he's talking about in this time frame, were literally able to become teachers and principals because of the handouts that they were given, not based on merit, but race. The very next day, they picketed the Board of Education and got Donovan to refuse Lesser's resignation. This reversal was applauded as a victory by the United Federation of Teachers, the teachers union. The UFT president-elect Albert Shanker said, had the board prevailed, our school system would have been destroyed. A Black principal would destroy the school system. Y'all are so extra. He warned that we must not permit extremism on the part of some parents to create a teacher backlash aimed at erecting a wall between the public and the schools. Oh shit, what the fuck? News of the reversal and the union's elation were greeted with great bitterness in Harlem. The reason why I said oh shit is because here this person, this superintendent is talking about had the parents had a say on who teaches their kids or who supervises their kids, that would have destroyed the school system. And that's crazy when you think about it, because it's like, wait a minute, these are their children. Why don't they have a say? Why can't they have a say? Again, that shows just the stronghold the state has on the school and why and what the purpose is of it. But let me not get too commie up in here. Let's see. News of reversal and the union's elation were greeted with great bitterness in Harlem, where some had hoped for an alliance of parents and teachers against the school board. The issue of professionalism shattered those hopes. A related issue drove in deeper the wedge between parents and teachers. Shanker had called for special facilities for disturbed children. 2 or 3 such pupils can totally disrupt the classroom, but the Black parents viewed this as an attempt to brand additional stigmas on their children, and they'd be correct. To them, the so-called disruptive child was simply a result of a demoralizing and dehumanizing school system. They argued that it was bad teachers and bad schools which created disturbed children, not vice versa. For them, the answer lay in getting rid of poor teachers and bringing the schools under community control, not in setting up special facilities for the disruptive pupils. After weeks of indecision and foot dragging on the IS 201 dispute, the school board, under pressure from Mayor John Lindsay, promised to appoint a task force to investigate the whole problem of ghetto schools and to make recommendations for sweeping changes. The Board of Education never set up such a task force, but Mayor Lindsay did, and it was headed up by none other than McGeorge Bundy. While this dispute was raging in New York, two Black students at Merritt College in Oakland, Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale, were organizing the local Black community and encouraging Black people to arm themselves. Appropriating the symbol of the County Freedom Organization, Newton and Seale called their new organization the Black Panther Party for self-defense. Explaining the symbolism, Seale said, "It's not in the Panther's nature to attack anyone first, but when he is attacked and backed into a corner, he will respond viciously and wipe out the aggressor. The aggressor in this case happens to be the police who patrol Black communities." Newton and Seale drew upon the experience of Black people in Los Angeles. Following the 1965 Watts uprising, the Black community there organized the Community Alert Patrol. CAP was funded in large part by federal money, and its function was to protect members of the Black community from police harassment and brutality. Whenever police were observed stopping Black people for investigation and interrogation, CAP headquarters would be notified and a CAP patrol vehicle dispatched to the scene to observe and report on the conduct of the police officers. The CAP team would also inform the Black person under detainment of his legal rights. The Panther founder took the CAP idea one step further. To dramatize their determination to curb police mistreatment of Blacks, the Panthers instituted armed patrols. This was perfectly legal, and the Panthers scrupulously avoided violating the law. Whenever police harassed ghetto residents, Panthers would arrive on the scene bearing rifles and shotguns. The Panthers also habitually carried with them law books from which they would quote the appropriate section of the legal code being violated by the police. The patrols were successful. A noticeable decrease was observed in the number of incidences of police harassment of the ghetto population at large, but the police increasingly turned on the Panthers themselves. The success of the patrols and the fact that the Panthers were armed and obviously ready to take care of business made a deep impression on the Black community, particularly among the youth and young adults. The organizations grew steadily as new recruits, mostly from poor and working class families, streamed in. Seale and Newton became chairman and minister of defense, respectively, of the young organization. Unlike SNCC and CORE, the Panthers were not a middle-class group. The majority of their rank-and-file members were recruited from the rebellious ghetto underclass. As one moves up into the leadership of the group, however, the incidence of middle-class members increases. In a sense, the Panther leadership represents an alliance between militant college students or ex-students and unlettered ghetto youths. Sorry. The Panthers are more than simply a self-defense or community patrol operation. They regard themselves as being in the vanguard of the Black Revolution. In an interview with this writer, Seale explained the party's political philosophy. "We tried to establish an organization that would articulate the basic desires and needs of the people, and in turn, try to organize Black people into having some kind of power position so that they can deal with the power and structure. The party realizes that the white power structure's real power is its military force, is its police force." It says both. "And by policemen, just like a foreign country might be occupied by foreign troops. Our politics comes from our hungry stomachs and our crushed heads and the vicious service revolver at a cop's side, which is used to tear our flesh, and from the knowledge that Black people are drafted to fight in wars, killing other colored people who've never done a damn thing to us. So how do we face these cops in the Black community? We have to face them exactly how they come down on us. They come down with guns and force. We must organize ourselves and put a shotgun in every Black man's home. Our political stand is that politics is war without bloodshed, and war is politics without bloodshed." I'm sorry. Let me read that quote again. Our politics stand in that politics is war without bloodshed, and war is politics with bloodshed. The politics of the Black Panther Party is expressed in its program to articulate the basic desires and needs of Black people. The Panthers in 1966 drafted a 10-point platform and program. 1. We want freedom. We want power to determine the destiny of our Black community. We believe that Black people will not be free until we are able to determine our destiny. 2. We want full employment for our people. We believe that the federal government is responsible and obligated to give every man employment or a guaranteed income. We believe that if the white American businessmen will not get full employment, then the means of production should be taken from the businessmen and placed in the community so that the people of the community can organize and employ all of its people and give a high standard of living. We want an end to the robbery by the white man of our Black community. We believe that this racist government has robbed us, and now we are demanding the overdue debt of 40 acres and two mules. 40 acres and 2 mules was promised 100 years ago as restitution for slave labor and mass murder of Black people. We will accept the payment in currency, which will be distributed to our many communities. The Germans are now aiding the Jews in Israel for the genocide of the Jewish people. The Germans murdered 6 million Jews. The American racist has taken part in a slaughter of over 50 million Black people. Therefore, we feel that this is a modest demand that we make. Number 4, we want decent housing, fit for shelter of human beings. We believe that if the white landlord will not give decent housing to our Black community, then the housing and the land should be made into cooperatives so that our community with government aid can build and make decent housings for its people. 5, we want education for our people that exposes the true nature of this decadent American society. We want education that teaches us our true history and role in the present day society. We believe in an educational system that will give to our people a knowledge of self. If a man does not have knowledge of self and his position in society and the world, then he has little chance to relate to anything else. 6, we want all Black men to be exempt from military service. We believe that Black people should not be forced to fight in the military service to defend a racist government that does not protect us. We will not fight and kill other people of color in the world who, like Black people, are being victimized by the white racist government of America. 7, we want an immediate end to the police brutality and murder of Black people. We believe we can end police brutality in our Black community by organizing Black self-defense groups that are dedicated to defending our Black community from racist police oppression and brutality. The Second Amendment to the Constitution of the United States gives a right to bear arms. We therefore believe that all Black people should arm themselves for self-defense. 8, we want freedom for all Black men held in federal, state, county, and city prisons and jails. We believe that all Black people should be released from the many jails and prisons because they have not received a fair and impartial trial. 9, we want all Black people, when brought to a trial, to be tried in a court by a jury of their peer group or people from their Black communities as defined by the Constitution of the United States. We believe that the courts should follow the United States Constitution to the Black so that Black people will receive fair trials. The 14th Amendment gives a man a right to be tried by his peer group. A peer is a person from a similar economic, social, religious, geographical, environmental, historical, and racial background. To do this, the court would be forced to select a jury from the Black community from which the Black defendant came from. We have been and are being tried by all white juries that have no understanding of the average reasoning man of the Black community. 10, we want land, bread, housing, education, clothing, justice, and peace. And as our major political objective, a United Nations supervised plebiscite to be held throughout the Black colony in which only Black colonial subjects will be allowed to participate for the purpose of determining the will of Black people as their national destiny. When in the course of human events it became necessary for one people to dissolve the political bonds which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature, and nature is God, entitle them. A decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impelled them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute a new government, laying in its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. I just find it interesting. I'm reading this today because as we currently stand on this recording, there are uprisings happening all over Western Africa and all over the continent, actually. You have the uprisings going on in West Papua that's been going on for years as they face genocide. And then, of course, you have the Palestinians fighting for their right to self-determination as they're being genocided by the Israeli white settler colonial state. And then, of course, you have Haiti that is still fighting, is still in uprisings currently right now. It's just really interesting. I'm reading this now, and I'm glad I am. Prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes, and accordingly, all experiences have shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer, while evils are sufferable than the right themselves to abolish the forms. Sorry, real quick, y'all. I have to take this medicine for breathing. Starting to run out of breath. Just 1 second. All right. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations pursuing invariably the same objective evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. This program is of great significance because it represented the first concrete attempt to spell out the meaning of Black power. It is a sweeping program ranging from such mundane but fundamental matters as employment and education to broad issues of freedom and self-determination, with the preamble to the U.S. Declaration of Independence included as a witness to the fact that the Black Panthers fall squarely within the stream of American revolutionary tradition. In the winter of 1968, Seal announced 4 community programs that the Panthers were undertaking as part of their drive to implement the 10-point political program. These included free breakfasts for needy Black children, a petition campaign for community control of police, and efforts to establish free health clinics in the Black community and Black liberation schools. Some have charged that these activities, and indeed the whole Panther program, are basically reformist. Replying to this, Seal remarked, "Some people are going to call these programs reformist, but we're revolutionaries. And what they call a reformist program is one thing when the capitalists put it up, and it's another thing when the revolutionary camp puts it up. Revolutionaries must always go forth to answer the momentary desires and needs of the people, the poor and oppressed people, while waging a revolutionary struggle. It's very important because it strengthens the people's revolutionary camp, while it weakens the camp of the capitalist power structure. Reforms are ends in themselves when implemented by the power structure, but when implemented by the ordinary working people of the Black community through an independent Black political party, reforms can become one means to the creation of a revolutionary new society. The critical question is who, or more specifically, what class controls the making of reforms and for what purpose? Both the Panthers and SNCC consider themselves to be revolutionary Black nationalist organizations. Black nationalism is usually treated by the mass media as a sensational but peripheral phenomenon of no more than passing interest. Actually, nationalism is embedded in the social fabric of Black America, and this must be understood if the problems of the Black liberation movement are to be fully appreciated. The next chapter is Black nationalism. Black power as a variant form of Black nationalism has roots that reach deep into the history and social fabric of Black America. Like an unsatisfied need or a nagging conscience, Black nationalism is an insistent motif that wins its way through Black history, particularly of the last 150 years. One writer has called nationalism the rejected strain, implying that assimilationism the desire to be fully incorporated into the surrounding white society, is the dominant and the only significant sentiment among Black people. A glance at history suggests that it would be more correct to say that nationalism and overt separatism are ever-present undercurrents in the collective Black psyche, which constantly interact with the assimilationist tendency and, in times of crisis, rise to the surface to become major themes. Both nationalism and assimilation spring from Black people's wish to be an integral part of a jargon society. This, after all, is what is meant by saying that man is a social animal. Nationalism, however, is rooted in the Afro-Americans' experience of being forcibly excluded from and rejected by a society which is usually overtly and always covertly racist and exploitative. In periods of social crisis, that is, when repression and terror are rampant or hopes of progress have been dashed, the resulting suspicion that equal participation is impossible because of certainty. Nationalist leaders and intellectuals come to the fore and assert that not only is racial integration not possible, it is not even desirable. Sorry, y'all, I'm struggling with this word. Such an eventuality. Oh, got it. That's what I get for playing too much. Such an eventuality, they contend, would destroy the group's distinctive culture and its sense of ethnic identity. Thus, in a decade prior to the Civil War, a period of increasing despair for Blacks, immigration movements were in vogue. The Fugitive Slave Act was passed by Congress as part of the Compromise of 1850, and thousands of fugitive slaves were forced to flee to Canada if they were to secure their freedom. In 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act opened Northern Territory to slavery, and in the infamous Dred Scott decision of 1857, the U.S. Supreme Court sanctioned the notion that Black people were not citizens. These were indeed grim years for the nearly 4.5 million Blacks that then living in this country. Many free Blacks, such as Frederick Douglass, became active in the abolitionist movement, but others sought some other way out of an increasingly oppressive situation. Martin R. Delady was one of the latter. In 1852, Delady advocated that Black people immigrate to the east coast of Africa to set up a nation of their own. We are a nation within a nation, he argued, sounding a now familiar note as the Poles in Russia, the Hungarians in Austria, the Welsh, Irish, and Scot in the British dominions. Delady called for a convention of the best Black intellects, a true representation of the intelligence and wisdom of the colored freemen, to lay plans for his colonial expedition. A convention to thrash out the question of immigration was actually held in 1854. 3 proposals were presented to this convention. In addition to Delady's, there were proposals that Black immigrate to Central America or to Haiti. Envoys were dispatched to these proposed areas of colonization to investigate conditions and sound out local governments. The immigrationists were not without their critics. Many free Blacks opposed the idea of immigration. Douglass, for example, expressed the fear that the immigration effort would encourage the best educated of the race to depart the country, leaving behind those least qualified to press forward with the emancipation struggle. But this was not the only reason that Blacks were critical of colonization schemes. One of the earliest colonization attempts was undertaken in 1815 by Paul Coffey, a relatively wealthy New England Black sailor. Coffey arranged for a small group of Black colonists to travel to Africa. This action is believed to have inspired the formation of the white-controlled American Colonization Society in 1816. By and large, however, Blacks were hostile to the society's colonization plans. Their opposition stemmed not so much from any lack of desire to separate from whites, but rather because they strenuously objected to the racist reasoning whites used in justifying immigration. The society, which counted a number of slaveholders among its founders, had as its express purpose the removal of free Blacks to Africa on the grounds that they were a dangerous and useless part of the community. This slur incensed most free Blacks and turned them irreversibly against any thought of colonizing Africa. Only a few wanted so desperately to escape the torture that was America that they would solicit aid, even from racists. Abraham Camp, a free black from Illinois, wrote a letter in 1818 to the society accepting its offer of aid in traveling to Africa or some other place. We love this country and its liberties if we could share an equal right to them, Camp wrote, but our freedom is partial, and we have no hope that it will ever be otherwise here. Therefore we had rather be gone. The Civil War and its aftermath put an end to talk of immigration. The Emancipation Proclamation formally ended slavery, and Black people were officially granted citizenship. Hopes were high among Blacks that equality and the good life were just over the horizon. Blacks sought in every conceivable way to participate fully in the nation's life, to become just ordinary Americans. It truly deemed that Douglas's faith, the faith that white America could change and accommodate itself to Blacks, was justified. Black men were elected to serve in every Southern legislature. South Carolina could even boast of a Black majority in its legislative chambers. Some 20 Blacks served in the U.S. House of Representatives, and the state of Mississippi sent 2 Black senators to Washington. These were the years of Reconstruction, and even the Ku Klux Klan and its campaign of terrorism seemed for the moment insufficient to stem the rising tide of Black hope. But what the Klan and Southern terrorists alone could not bring about, a tacit alliance of Southern reactionaries with Northern business interests and an uneasy Northern white populace, could indeed accomplish. Historians Lerone Bennett Jr. has noted that throughout this period, Northern reporters and Northern opinion makers were shrewdly and effectively cultivated by Southerners who dangled the bait of profit, telling Northern industrialists that nothing stood between them and maximum exploitation of the rich resources of the South, except Negro governments. The Northern industrialists, being businessmen, fell for the bait of promised profits and began clamoring for a settlement of the troubles which had developed in the South as a result of terrorist violence and the Depression of 1873. Meanwhile, nervous whites in the North, more concerned with maintaining domestic tranquility than ensuring justice for all, were nearly panicked into a stampede by the seemingly indecisive Hayes-Tilden presidential election of 1876, which brought with it the threat of a new civil war. Hayes, a Republican, was bitterly opposed in the South, but it appeared that he had won a majority of the electoral votes. The Southerners staged a filibuster, which disrupted the orderly counting of the electoral votes in the House of Representatives. An anonymously threatening atmosphere developed as it became clear that Inauguration Day would come and pass without a president having been chosen. With pressure mounting from both industrialists and the general Northern public, a settlement was reached in the form of Hayes-Tilden Compromise of 1877. Hayes promised the white Southerners the right to control their own affairs in their own way. In return for an end to the filibuster, he also said he would withdraw the federal troops remaining in the South. Meaning, like, the compromise was that we won't stand in the way of y'all just being whole-ass white terrorists in the South. And not only that, but we'll remove the troops we put there to help protect some of the rights that Black folks have fought down there to achieve. So basically, just told them, like, white supremacists on white supremacists. The federal troops have been particularly the only thing standing between Black people and their tormentors. True, there were some Black militia units organized, but with the return of state power to the hands of white racists, these Black men didn't stand much of a chance. The settlement was climaxed when the U.S. Supreme Court, in another infamous decision, declared the Civil Rights Act of 1875 unconstitutional. Southern states rewrote their constitutions to disenfranchise Black people, and any Blacks who still showed an interest in the ballot were terrorized and murdered by the Klan. Segregation replaced slavery as the accepted mode of Black subjugation. This was a bitter experience for Blacks who realized that as far as their supposed white friends were concerned, when self-interest conflicted with anti-slavery idealism, the latter proved dispensable. Thousands of Blacks were lynched in the South between 1880 and 1900. Hundreds of thousands of others soon began the Great Northward Track in a vain search for some non-existent promised land. They were met by hatred and violence little different from what they had known in the South. There were anti-Black riots in New York in 1900, in Springfield, Ohio in 1904, in Greensburg, Indiana in 1906, and another massive riot in Springfield in 1908. It was this crisis which thrust forward both Booker T. Washington and W. Du Bois as spokesmen. These men were ideological antagonists, and while neither is usually regarded today as being a Black nationalist, the thinking of both exhibited curiously nationalist undertones. Washington is frequently described as an Uncle Tom accommodationist, while Du Bois is thought of as the father of the civil rights protest movement. Both leaders were trying to force a viable response to the imposition of segregation and growing anti-Black violence. Social critic Harold Cruse has argued that Washington actually laid the basic economic foundation and motivation for Negro nationalism in America, even though he himself was no militant nationalist. The reason for this, according to Cruz, is that Washington was the Negro bourgeois prophet par excellence, and Black nationalism is usually bourgeois in its origins, in its earliest inceptions. Washington advocated the uplifting of the Black communities. 1 second. Sorry about that. I had to take some of my breathing medicine. Let's see. Washington is frequently described as Uncle Tom. Okay, social critic Harold Cruz has argued that Washington actually laid the basic economic foundation, motivation for Negro nationalism in America, even though he himself was no militant nationalist. The reason for this, according to Cruz, is that Washington was the Negro bourgeois prophet par excellence, and Black nationalism is usually bourgeois in its origins and its earliest inceptions. Washington advocated the uplifting of the Black masses through industrial education and economic self-help projects. He founded Tuskegee Institute as a school to train Black workers in agricultural and industrial vocations, and among his economic enterprises was the African Union Company, which he organized to promote trade between American Blacks and the Gold Coast of Africa. At the turn of the century, to provide an institutional base for his idea that in the building of a Black capitalist class lay the way to racial economic advancement, Washington founded the Negro Business League. Washington was willing to forego Black participation in politics and to accept segregation as the price to be paid for white financial support of his educational and economic efforts. But he thought that this was only a temporary concession and honestly believed that the Black men who succeeded in business would be treated with the highest respect by the members of the white race. Unconsciously, Washington was playing a part analogous to the classic role assumed by a national bourgeois in an underdeveloped colonial country. Tell it. He was trying to create a native Black capitalist class and appeal to the latent nationalist sentiment of the native Black masses and urging them to support this new class. At the 11th annual conference of the Negro Business League in 1910, Washington, in a keynote address, urged his hearers to leave determined that each individual shall be a missionary in his community, a missionary in teaching the masses to get property, to be more thrifty, more economical, and resolve to establish an industrial enterprise wherever a possibility presents itself. Just Black and bougie. Washington believed that the masses would follow this course out of a sense of racial pride and solidarity, what would be called Black consciousness today. Those who took his advice, however, probably did so for other reasons. Abram L. Harris, in his book The Negro as Capitalist, contends that although obscenely sponsored as the means of self-help or racial cooperation, as it was sometimes called, through which the masses were to be economically emancipated, Negro business enterprise was motivated primarily by the desire for private profit and looked toward the establishment of a Negro capitalist employer class. Whip up nationalist feeling among the masses if their struggle is to be successful. Calls to support your own become weapons in a fierce battle for economic hegemony. It is in this sense that Washington is to be viewed as a spokesman for bourgeois nationalism. The difficulty with Washington's program was that he failed to see that American capitalism had by then left the stage of free competition and entered that of a monopoly in the industrial and corporate areas, with bank loans and credits, not a businessman's own small capital, determining his success. Blacks had no capital to speak of, and financiers who, after all, are capable of recognizing a threat to their own interests, saw no reason to provide them any. As a result, Black businesses down to the present day have been largely confined to small-scale marginal operations. There is no substantial Black capitalist class, only a handful of Black capitalists. Du Bois was an art critic of Washington. He accused Washington of shifting the burden for Black oppression from the nation as a whole to the shoulders of Black people. He attacked Washington for counseling submission to oppression. Du Bois helped organize the Niagara movement in 1905 to counter the program of the Washingtons, following in the tradition of Frederick Douglass and basing themselves on the tenet that persistent manly agitation is the way to liberty. The Black intellectuals who formed the Niagara movement drafted a statement of principles calling for, among other things, male suffrage, full civil rights, economic opportunity, and education of Black youth according to ability. These were the militants of the day, and they would brook no talk of the Black man meekly accepting his assigned lowly place in the order of things. We refuse to allow the impression to remain, they thundered, and the Negro American assents to inferiority is submissive under oppression and apologetic before insults. Through helplessness, we may submit, but the voice of protest of 10 million Americans must never cease to assail the ears of their fellows, so long as America is unjust. The order must be changed, protested the Niagara activists. Unfortunately, the Niagara movement seldom got beyond oratorial protest, and eventually it was absorbed into the newly formed National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. The NAACP, established in 1910, soon became the major mass-based organization demanding Negro admission into the mainstream of American life. There was another aspect to Du Bois' character during this period, his cultural nationalism. Du Bois expressed an almost mystical faith in the dignity and innate sense of justice found in the souls of Black folk. He felt that a strong cultural and psychological bond existed between American Blacks and Africans, and he suggested that the communalism of the African clan might readily be transferred to Black America. Du Bois gave verbal form to his faith in a credo written in 1904. Especially do I believe in the Negro race, in the beauty of its genius, the sweetness of its soul, and its strength in that meekness which shall inherit this turbulent earth. I believe in pride of race and lineage itself, and pride of self so deep as to scorn injustice to other selves, and pride of lineage so great as to despise no man's father, and pride of race so chivalrous as neither to offer bastardy to the weak nor beg wedlock of the strong. Du Bois' fight for the word Negro as against small n Negro. So basically what it says is he argued to capitalize Negro, just like we do with Black or colored, was a militant and significant for its day as the recent fight for the word Black, now that Negro has come to represent the mentality of the NAACP, very much changed from the time when Du Bois was its guiding figure. Soon Du Bois developed an interest in Pan-Africanism. And he organized Pan-African Congress in 1911, 1918, 1923, and 1927, and 1945. Pan-Africanism was anti-colonial, anti-imperialist in conception and purpose, and no mere cultural movement. Du Bois and the African George Padmore are the acknowledged fathers of African nationalism, and Du Bois could hardly be that without having been, in some measure, himself a Black nationalist. Du Bois' nationalism was so insistent that at times it completely overwhelmed his fervor for Marxism. For a short period, very early in his life, he had been influenced by Marxism, but in 1933 he wrote an article for Crisis magazine entitled Marxism and the Negro Problem, in which he asserted that both the white capitalist and the white proletariat participate in the exploitation of Black people. Absolutely. When it comes to racial oppression, Du Bois, the nationalist, argued, whites are all the same. Sorry, I needed that laugh. Because I be saying that shit all the time. And I lost my place. See what happens? I play too much. And Ritchie asserted that both the white capitalists and the white proletariat participate in exploitation of black people. When it comes to racial oppression, Du Bois, the nationalists, argue whites are all the same. But within a very few years, the activity of some Marxists, specifically the Communist Party, for admission of blacks into unions for food for the hungry in the Great Depression against blatant expressions of racism, as was seen in the Scottsboro case, began the process that closed with Du Bois joining the Communist Party in the last decade of his life. If the crisis theory being outlined here is correct in examining outbursts of nationalist feeling, then the question arises why Du Bois and Washington were not more overt black nationalists. In the case of Du Bois, he was probably his early affinity for the Marxism of the Socialist Party with its colorblindness, but held him back from becoming an outspoken black nationalist. Throughout his life, Du Bois seemed to be trying with limited success to reconcile nationalism with Marxism. As for Washington, his close ties with prominent white benefactors ensured that he could not safely utter any militant statements and required that he couch his nationalism in very cautious terms. The thesis of Washington's 1895 Atlanta Exposition address, for example, when stripped of its timorous formulations and apologies, can be boldly restated in terms which would satisfy even the most ardent nationalist. Without altering basic meaning, cast down your buckets where you are can become, we must build an independent economy in the black community. Or, in all things that are purely social, we can be as separate as the fingers. Could have been, we have no desire for social intercourse with a cold and soulless race. Talking about the old phase. As essential feature of black nationalism is that the nationalist makes a virtue of the fact of black separateness from the bulk of American society. The only difference in the formulations above is that one set of statements does so in a in a half-hearted manner, and the other set asserts separateness as a positive good. Incidentally, both Washington and Du Bois are excellent examples of the ambivalence which afflicts middle-class black leaders. Du Bois once wrote that the Negro group has long been internally divided by dilemmas as to whether striving upwards should be aimed at strengthening interculture and group bonds, both for intrinsic progress and for offensive power against caste, or whether it should seek escape wherever and however possible into the surrounding American culture. Basically, he's saying like they were forced with two things, either assimilate or revolt. The middle-class black leader, particularly in times of social stress, personifies this dilemma. This is because, as will be examined in later pages, the black middle class as a whole vacillates between the two approaches posted by Du Bois. Another major crisis for the Negro occurred at the time of World War I. When the war was declared, white leaders piled black people with promises of equality. President Woodrow Wilson assured blacks that with thousands of your sons in the camps and in France, out of this conflict, you must expect nothing less than the enjoyment of full citizenship rights. Sick. The same as are enjoyed by every other citizen. Just lying. More than 350,000 black men served in the U.S. Armed Forces, and most of these were sent to France. But the promises proved to be empty. The Klan was reorganized in Georgia in 1915 and spread rapidly across the country. Within 10 years, it had an estimate membership of 4 million. In July of 1917, a white mob ran wild in East St. Louis, wrecking some 300 homes of blacks and killing 125 black men, women, and children. In the first year after the war, 70 blacks were lynched. Many of these were black soldiers, some still wearing their uniforms. Black soldiers who had fought bravely in France, many of them winning citations for heroism, were not even permitted to march in the Paris Victory Parade of 1919. During the same period, from 1915 to 1919, the black exodus from the South reached flood proportions. Some 750,000 black refugees migrated to the North, searching for jobs and seeking to escape the legal and illegal barriers to progress which had been thrown up in the southern states. It was in this setting, got some water. It was in this setting that Black nationalism again found expression, this time in the person of Marcus Garvey. Garvey took Washington's economic program, clothed it in militant nationalist rhetoric, and built an organization which in its heyday enjoyed the active support of millions of Black people. Garvey, a Jamaican by birth, identified the problem of American Negroes with the problem of colonialism in Africa. He believed that until Africa was liberated, there was no hope for Black people anywhere. He founded his Universal Negro Improvement Association in 1914 in Jamaica with the motto, "One God, one aim, one destiny." But it was not until Garvey established his group in New York's Harlem in 1917 that it began to assume notable proportions. Within 2 months, the UNIA had 1,500 members. The African Student of American Black Nationalism, Eastern Edom, outlined Garvey's beliefs. Garvey's ideology was both nationalist and racial. His nationalist objective was the redemption of Africa for Africans abroad and at home. He advocated racial purity, racial integrity, and racial hegemony. He sought to organize Negroes in the United States into a vanguard for Africa's redemption from colonialism and hoped eventually to lead them back to Africa. The major instrument for the achievement of these objectives was economic cooperation through racial solidarity. He believed that if the Negroes were economically strong in the United States, they would be able to redeem Africa and establish a worldwide confraternity of Black people. Above all, he believed that the Negroes of the world, united together by the consciousness of race and nationality, could become a great and powerful people. Garvey believed that economic power through ownership of businesses could lay a solid foundation for eventual Black salvation. He established the Black Star Steamship Company, the Negro Factory Corporation, and sent a commercial and industrial mission to Liberia. All of these undertakings turned out to be complete failures because of incompetence, mismanagement, and other difficulties. Garvey was a charismatic leader, and his movement had a certain theatrical quality and flamboyance which made it appealing to the Black masses. Colorful parades, uniforms, and marching songs were distinctive traits of the UNIA. At an ostentatious convention in 1920, Garvey himself was named Provisional President of Africa and President General and Administrator of the UNIA. A provisional government was formed, and Garvey conferred knighthood upon the members of his High Executive Council. In 1925, Garvey was convicted of using the mails to defraud. This sentence was commuted by President Calvin Coolidge in 1927, and Garvey was deported as an undesirable alien. He died in London in 1940. After Garvey was deported, his movement split into factions and degenerated. Thousands of hopeful Blacks lost the precious savings which they had invested in the UNIA. Black bourgeois nationalism was in decline from 1930 through 1945. The Depression struck Negroes with disproportionate severity, but the New Deal, created partly in response to pressure from the left, eased the situation. Blacks were admitted to federal work projects and civilian conservation corps programs. It was during this period that the Communist Party succeeded in establishing itself for the first time as the leading advocate of equal rights for Black people. Politically, the Communists recognized the Negroes of the Black Belt to be a nation, and in the northern ghettos to be a national minority suffering special discrimination, unlike the older Socialist Party, which regarded Blacks simply as dark-skinned poor workers and farmers without special problems. The Communists, however, did not press their program of self-determination of the Black Belt and instead concentrate on trade union work and anti-discrimination struggles. They organized the American Negro Labor Congress, while their interracial trade union Unity League fought to wipe out discrimination against Negro workers in the industries and in the unions, and demanded equal pay for equal work, especially for Negroes. In 1930, the ANLC was succeeded by the League of Struggle for Negro Rights, with Langston Hughes as president. On May 8, 1933, it led a march of 3,500 to Washington to present President Roosevelt the Bill of Civil Rights for the Negro people, which it had drafted. In the South, the Communists organized the Sharecropper Union in 1931, which attained 6,000 members by 1934 in Alabama, Florida, Georgia, and the Carolinas. It defended farmers against foreclosures, even to the use of guns. 5 were killed in such encounters. In March 1930, the Communist Party claimed a total of about 1,500 Black members, but by 1938, this figure had risen to 10,000, or 14% of the total party membership. Adam Clayton Powell praised the communists and said that today there is no group in America, including the Christian churches, that practices racial brotherhood 1/10 as much as the Communist Party. The Unemployed Council, founded by the communists, were the largest and most militant interracial organizations this country has known. A 19-year-old Black communist organizer, Angela Herndon, led an interracial march for welfare in Atlanta, Georgia in 1932. Sentenced to 18 to 20 years on the chain gang for attempting to incite an insurrection, he was freed by an immense national campaign which brought into the communist movement his lawyer, Benjamin Davis, who later became, as a communist, the second Black city councilman in New York, succeeding Adam Clayton Powell on the latter's election to Congress. Davis was recruited by the remarkable William L. Patterson, son of a slave who was more responsible for the successful defense of the Scottsboro Boys, 9 Black youths accused in 1931 of raping 2 white women, than any other individual. Patterson's organization of mass demonstration defenses and legal cases continued until 1951, when he led several hundred people to the South in an unsuccessful attempt to save the Martinsville 7, charged with rape, from execution. This was the last movement-sized undertaking of the American Communist Party in its 20 years as the most influential radical force in the Black community. But Patterson, now 75 years old and still a communist, continues to be effective. His 1951 book-length petition to the United Nations, We Charge Genocide, is presently on the reading list of the Black Panther Party. It was on his advice that the Panthers engaged a white attorney prepared to conduct a militant defense, Charles Gary, as lawyer for Huey P. Newton. It was also on his advice that the Panthers conducted the mass demonstration Free Huey campaign in defense of Newton. The creation in 1935 of the Congress of Industrial Organizations under militant communist prodding had the consequence that Black and white workers fought side by side for their mutual benefit in the rubber, auto, steel, and mining industries, as well as in the National Maritime Union and the West Coast International Longshoresmen and Warehousemen's Union. Black economic boycotts were organized. Don't buy where you can't work, the organizers shouted. With the advent of World War II, Black men once again came to the defense of the country. At first, there was some hesitancy because of discrimination and segregation in the defense program. A. Philip Randolph threatened a massive Black march on Washington in 1941 unless President Franklin D. Roosevelt brought a halt to discrimination in defense plans. Executive Order 8802, establishing the Federal Fair Employment Practices Commission, did just that. It prohibited racial and religious discrimination in war industries, government training programs, and government industries. The planned march was called off. Over 1 million Black men served in the armed forces during the war. They served in all capacities. Black pilots were trained in the Army Flying School in Tuskegee, Alabama, and in 1942, the Booker T. Washington, the first U.S. merchant ship to be commanded by a Black captain, was launched. All right. On the home front, Black workers taking advantage of the defense jobs, which were now open to them, began to improve their economic status. The income gap between Black and white families closed appreciably during the period of World War II and the Korean War, because pressure for hiring and upgrading the Black workers fell off as the government successfully destroyed the Communist Party. A. Philip Randolph, a master strategist, used the wartime period of international turmoil to advance the Negro cause. In 1948, he proclaimed to a Senate committee that he would advise Black youths to refuse military induction unless segregation and discrimination were banned in the armed forces. Once more, President yielded to Randolph's threat, and Harry Truman directed that the armed forces provide equal treatment and equal opportunity to all personnel. But executive orders were not sufficient to combat the virus of racism which afflicted white America. At the height of the war in 1943, a bloody race riot occurred in Detroit, Michigan, and 34 persons died. Earlier in the same year, troops had to be called in when a riot broke out in Mobile, Alabama, following the upgrading of Black workers at a shipyard. After the war, there was a resurgence of Klan activity and Southern terrorism. More ominously, automation was by then clearly the wave of the future, raising the specter of widespread technological unemployment. Large numbers of Blacks by that time were firmly lodged in northern cities, and the activities of the communists and later of men like Randolph had made them aware, if only vaguely, of the latent power which they possessed. Important gains had been made during the war, but these were now threatened by post-war developments. For ordinary Black people, particularly those in the northern cities, the question was how best to safeguard their newly achieved economic and social status. Two forms of Black leadership projected programs designed to answer this question. The first was represented by the NAACP and the Congress of Racial Equality, which was organized in 1942. As early as 1945, NAACP lawyers had begun making plans for a massive legal assault on the edifice of segregation. CORE activists favored the nonviolent direct action approach. In 1947, CORE, in conjunction with the Fellowship of Reconciliation, organized the first Freedom Ride, then called a Journey of Reconciliation. Its purpose was to test the enforcement of a U.S. Supreme Court decision outlawing segregation on interstate buses. Although the NAACP and CORE differed in their tactics, they were in agreement on the ultimate objective, to fight for racial integration as the means for ensuring Black equality. While these two organizations went about their work, increasing numbers of Blacks were turning to another organization, the Nation of Islam, sometimes known as the Black Muslims. The Muslims had been around since the early 1930s, but their membership had never climbed much above 10,000 in pre-war years. In fact, by 1945, their ranks had dwindled to about 1,004 temples. After the war, however, there was a steady growth both in the number of members and in the number of Muslim temples scattered in cities across the country. The NAACP and integrationism were boosted to national prominence in 1954 when the U.S. Supreme Court handed down its famous public school desegregation decision. Some people thought the struggle was close to reaching a successful conclusion. But this decision had little effect on the steady growth of the Muslim organization. In 1955, there were 15 temples. This number rose to 30 temples in 28 cities by March of 1959. With the insight gained by the passage of time, it is now clear that the Muslim appeal was not diminished by 1954 decision because their base was fundamentally different from that of the NAACP and CORE. Both CORE and NAACP were middle-class organizations which directed their attention to attacking the legal forms of segregation, which were prevalent in the South. The Muslims were strongest amongst working-class Blacks who resided in the urban areas of the North. Court decisions and Southern freedom rides had little or no effect on the concrete economic status of these Blacks. It was in the summer of 1930 that a mysterious prophet, W.D. Farad, appeared in Detroit peddling raincoats and silks and dispensing strange teachings about Africa, the white man, the Christian church, and Islam. Soon he organized the first temple of Islam, and by 1934, when Farad mysteriously disappeared, the movement had grown to 8,000 members. It was then that Elijah Muhammad came into power. Muhammad was minister of Islam under Farad. Both Elijah Poole in Georgia, his family migrated to Detroit, where he joined the new movement and was given his original Islamic name. His slave name, Poole, was then dropped. Under Muhammad's guidance, Farad was deified and identified with Allah, and the Muslim movement grew into a dedicated, tightly disciplined bloc with the membership estimate in the early 1960s as between 65,000 and 100,000. Muhammad set himself up in a mansion in Chicago where Temple No. 2, the Muslim headquarters, is located. The Muslims established a University of Islam. Their temples are found in practically every major American city, and they are collectively engaged in far-flung business and real estate activities. The Muslim ideology is compounded of a fantastic mythology coupled with elements of Orthodox Islamic doctrine. The Muslims reject Christianity, which they regard as the white man's religion, and instead have constructed their own version of Islam. Allah is seen as the supreme Black man, and it is asserted that the first men were Black men. C. Eric Lincoln, in his classic study of the Muslims, described their beliefs. The originality of the Black nation and the creation of the white race by Yaqub, a Black scientist in rebellion against Allah. This is a central myth of the Black Muslim movement. It is the fundamental premise upon which rests the whole theory of Black supremacy and white degradation. These devils, white men, were given 6,000 years to rule. The allotted span of their rule was ended in 1914, and their years of grace will last no longer than is necessary for the chosen of Allah to be resurrected from the mental death imposed upon them by the white man. This resurrection is the task of Muhammad himself, messenger of Allah and spiritual leader of the lost foundation in the West. End of quote. With this resurrection, the white slave masters are to be destroyed in a catastrophic battle of Armageddon. The Muslim program calls for racial separation and a complete economic withdrawal from white society. This is to accumulate in the establishment of a separate black state. On the back page of each issue, Muhammad Speaks, the weekly Muslim newspaper, are detailed the Muslim demands. We want our people in America whose parents or grandparents were descendants from slaves to be allowed to establish a separate state or territory of their own, either on this continent or elsewhere. We believe that our former slave masters are obligated to provide such land and that the area must be fertile and mineral rich. We believe that our former slave masters are obligated to maintain and supply our needs in this separate territory for the next 20 to 25 years until we are able to produce and supply our own needs. Since we cannot get along with them in peace and equality after giving them 400 years of our sweat and blood and receiving in return some of the worst treatment human beings have ever experienced, we believe our contribution to this land and the suffering forced upon us by white America justifies our demand for complete separation in a state or a territory of our own. These obviously are long-term demands. In the interim, the Muslims want equality of legal treatment, employment, educational opportunities, although in the latter, they want schools which are segregated by sex. Muslim organizations grew in response to a perceived threat to the economic security of a certain class of Black people. Black workers made significant occupational advances in 1940 in intermediate level jobs such as operatives and kindred workers, but this category of workers had hard hit by technological unemployment due to automation. In 1960, for example, the unemployment rate in this category was 6.4% for males and 9.9% for females, a higher rate of unemployment than among any other category of workers except laborers. At the same time that some Black workers were moving into this new category, the demand for unskilled and semi-skilled labor categories in which Blacks are traditionally overrepresented was declining faster than Black workers could be retained for other lines of work. Economic self-sufficiency of the race as a whole, the Muslims propose following a by now well-worn path, is the only solution to this problem. Racial integration is no answer, they contend, because it can't work. The effectiveness of the Muslim was limited, however, by their religious mysticism, which alienated many Blacks and obscured the question of how to change power relations in America by the fact that the organization served in large part as simply an alternative route to middle-class status for some Blacks, rather than actively attacking the problem of general Black oppression. Nonetheless, the nationalist position was measurably strengthened in the middle 1960s when it became obvious to many observers that the integration and civil rights movement had reached its peak and was in decline, having only minimally affected the lives of ordinary Black people. This failure compounded the crisis, which was precipitated at the close of the war years. The next phase of nationalist expression followed the demise of the civil rights movement. The modern civil rights movement was launched by one of those little incidents, which happen all the time, but which in a revolutionary epoch can consume awesome proportions. In December 1955, Miss Rosa Parks, a Black woman weary from work, refused to give up her seat. What? Sorry, he's been a couple of things in here he said that I've been wanting to contest, but let me just keep reading. In December 1955, Ms. Rosa Parks, a Black woman weary from work, refused to give up her seat on a Montgomery, Alabama city bus to a white man. The irate white bus driver had her arrested for this upon affront to the unwritten but nonetheless real Southern behavioral code. The driver could not know that Southern Blacks were like a coiled spring and that tension had reached a breaking point. Ms. Parks was arrested little more than a year after the 1954 Supreme Court school decision, a decision which many Southern Blacks thought spelled the end of segregation, but the white South had responded in classic style and openly defled the court ruling. The formation of the first White Citizens Council in Indianola, Mississippi, just 2 months after the court decision passed the bitter struggle which was to come. Blacks, however, were in no mood for more procrastination. This was it. If talk of integration meant anything, now it was time for the struggle to be joined and fought to its conclusion, whatever that might be. Within 2 days, the Black people of Montgomery had begun organizing a massive boycott of the municipal buses. A young Baptist minister, Martin Luther King Jr., who had arrived in town only months earlier, was named to head up the boycott. King was given the job probably because he was new and not identified with any of the factions which splintered the Black community. It took more than a year for the bus boycott to succeed and finally forcing desegregation of public transportation facilities in Montgomery. But the struggle represented a clear victory for the nonviolent, direct action tactics advocated by the newcomer from Atlanta. The tactic of court struggle stressed by the NAACP was cast into shadow, and King became a national leader. King moved on to new battles. As he wrote in his account of the Montgomery drama, Stride Toward Freedom, the problem in that city was merely symptomatic of the larger national problem. He decided to go wherever necessary to attack this problem. Nonviolent change for the better was possible, King believed, if only the federal government and liberal whites would back the Negro struggle. It was this belief which, as the crisis of Black America deepened, converted King into what some regard as a reluctant accomplice of the white power structure. As the years passed, the liberal establishment tried to use King to restrain the threatening rebelliousness of the Black masses and the young militants. Thus, one of the admitted purposes of his Poor People's Campaign, for example, was to channel that rebelliousness into a movement he thought could be as effective as Gandhi had been. In the press, in the press, his calls for nonviolence were frequently contrasted with the rabble rousing of Black militants. King could not repudiate this role because he was convinced that the establishment could be pushed and pressured to implement his program, provided that he did not move so far or so fast as to lose his white liberal support. In 1957, King organized his Southern Christian Leadership Conference, composed and mostly of Black ministers from 10 states. With SCLC as a base, King led numerous economic boycotts and desegregation and voter registration campaigns in cities such as Albany, Georgia, Birmingham, Alabama, St. Augustine, Florida, and Selma, Alabama. Jailed and beaten frequently, he was nearly killed in 1958 when he was stabbed in the chest by a Black woman while he was autographing books in Harlem. In his wanderings, King seemed to be in search of a new Montgomery, the right confrontation or combination of demonstrations which would wake up white America and result in the granting of full equality to Black people. In 1963 and the March on Washington, King's dream was no closer to be realized. Already, even among some of those who demonstrated in support of it, there was the gnawing suspicion that the Civil Rights Bill, if passed, would not be effectively enforced, that it was only another palliative. Critics sprang up where none had been before. King himself was accused of being opportunistic in his campaigns and of not seeing them through to the finish. A new breed of leaders drawn from the northern ghettos of the fierce rural civil rights dives in the South was growing into maturity. Black Muslim minister Malcolm X challenged King's espousal of integration and nonviolence. Later, after he left the Muslims, Malcolm, a cogent and persuasive speaker, advocated the need for radical change, and many listened. Young skeptical leaders were also being tempered in King's stepchild organization, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. These activists, mostly college students or ex-students, were beginning to examine political and economic exploitation and the American government's perpetuation of injustice not only at home but in foreign countries. In January 1966, SNCC left the fold of traditional civil rights activity by taking a stand in opposition to the Vietnam War and the military draft. The SNCC radicals felt they were involved in a movement of worldwide dimensions. So I'll go ahead and stop there, and the next space will pick up like where I left off. I'm gonna try to get some rest because I'm actually tired, but thank y'all for coming again. I really appreciate y'all. And hopefully I get better so the space can be better. We can have discussions. So I'm really sorry for cutting them short like this, but hopefully these still help. And take care of yourselves. And also keep eyes on Ghana. I know they're currently having space. I'll probably be there in the listening session to keep learning, but they're currently going through protesters are locked up, and I believe they're supposed to be released sometime tomorrow. But yeah, go to those spaces and support our brothers and sisters over there. All right, y'all take care.